Thank you, Mr. van der Berge. Let's jump straight into it and get into our first conversation. I think that was a wonderful roundup of all of the topics we're going to touch on. So thank you for doing my job, Mr. van der Berge. That was perfect. I don't have to even explain what the first panel is about, because adaptation strategies and national adaptation strategies and building a climate resilient European Union is where we're going to kick it off. And our panelists bring very specific and very distinct lens to this conversation, from policy and insurance to science and economics. So if I can invite them all on stage to join me. Nicolas Gemot is the head of personal and general insurance at Insurance Europe. If you can take that last seat, that would be fantastic. Blas Kernick is the head of climate change impacts and adaptation at the European Environment Agency, who's had multiple shout-outs, so we know we're going to keep asking him a lot of data questions. Karen Pittel is the director of the EFO Center for Energy, Climate and Resources. And Frank Menmans is associate professor at the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics. Thank you all for joining me in this conversation. Well, let's kick it off with the first question here, and maybe we start with you, Blas, since you've had so many shout-outs in our keynote. You track all the data. You give all the data to policy-making and decision-making folks. What is currently missing in terms of adaptation strategies and implementation, and how do you bridge the gap, as Mr. van der Berge kind of insinuated, that there is a gap, they're trying really hard. How do you bridge the gap between knowledge and implementation when we talk about preparedness and resilience? I'm going to stop using adaptation.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. And one point to say, like, what is missing? We should say what we have. I think we have in Europe a wealth of a lot of data, a lot of information, and we can use this data information for the informed decision making. And that's basically what we are doing at this stage. So the European Climate Risk Assessment, which we published last year and could mention a couple of times, it was done together with DG Klima, so thanks for that. And it was a really a good report showing that risks are affecting the whole Europe. There are, of course, different regions which will be affected by different risks, and in particular, the Southern Europe is being really exposed to these risks. And what we need more is to basically understand how to translate these risks into the action at the local level, because adaptation is happening at the local level. And translating the information from some kind of global level to the local level is really complex. It involves a lot of uncertainty, and decision making at the end wants to have one number. And how to make sure that we can bring this number, which would be a number which would be holding over the let's say the years or the decades in the future. This is really an important, let's say, development. And so gaps and uncertainty is one thing which we need to develop further. The second thing which we need to develop further is about how to properly invest, because there is not unlimited resources. And if you ask, if there is the decision maker will say, I need to improve this sewage system to be climate proofed, it's important to be as accurate as possible what needs to be done and how much this will, how much of the resources this will require. And that's also important, that the gap is to properly allocate the resources for something which has the output which is very important for this local level.
Is there an example you can give that actually speaks to that has been done right, no matter how small an example that might be?
There are lots of cities which are investing into the green spaces in the cities. And green spaces means it's not only improving the parks, it's actually bringing a lot of added value towards well-being and health of the society. And then, and this is across Europe, we have examples which are showing how good these kind of investments are, and how these investments are paying off. Because it's not only investment into the greening the city, it's also investment into the well-being, into the society, into the improved health, but also attracting the tourism, because we want to travel in the cities which have, let's say, green spaces. And these examples are visible across Europe, and in the European Climate Adaptation Platform, we are showing around 130 different examples or the case studies, not only about the greening the city, about how the good implementation is happening across Europe.
Karen, if I can ask you to pick up on that and kind of paint the picture of the fact that this is not just a climate imperative, it tends to then go into a whole different genre. This is an economic imperative, as was highlighted by both Professor Fust and also Mr. Vandenberger. How do you kind of tie the dots to say this is what happens to GDP with adaptation and without? How do you tell that story without it going into some kind of activism mode?
Now, basically, we have seen estimates of damages that climate change can do for quite some decades by now. We have much less really paid attention on how much damage reduction we can get through better adaptation or resilience. I mean, depending on how you want to frame it. Although there is some numbers by now, for example, for Germany, we have estimates that depending on the pace of climate change and also depending on the effort level yet you dedicate towards adaptation, you could reduce the harm done by climate change by half or even way more. So there's a lot of actually leverage in there. And also when you look at the damages, I mean, the numbers are sometimes quite staggering. I mean, they differ a lot between European regions, like you said. I mean, they're usually way lower for northern regions than for southern regions, but still they're sizable with respect to GDP reduction. And if you can avoid that, that's great. But for a very long time, we did not really pay that much attention to adaptation. I think at least the common narrative on why that was, and I'm not sure whether that's true or not, is that if you actually kind of surrender in the sense that you acknowledge that you have to adapt, you're not devoting as much attention towards reducing emissions. And I think by now we're beyond that. So we know we have to do both. But having macro numbers is one thing, but then you also have to break them down. And there is much less information out there with respect to individual projects, whether they have what economists like to call a positive cost-benefit ratio. But for those that you actually look at, they're usually way positive. I mean, for many, many of the projects, you actually see that the benefits by far outweigh the cost. But it's not always done really rigorously, trying to analyze that. I mean, Copenhagen is probably a very good example of where it was done after a disastrous flooding event. They looked at different options, grey infrastructure, green infrastructure, combination of both, and then also with respect to the benefits, with respect to, on the one hand, of course, the well-being of people living there, but also land values. So there's a lot of different things that actually play a role. And then basically trying to get a better idea of how much adaptation can bring you also on the local level, I think that's what we need in order to also foster it more on the municipality level.
If I can ask the audience, just to kind of gauge where your minds are at, do you think policymakers across Europe are currently still more focused on mitigation? I know Mr. Vandenberger would like us to think of it as one thing, but do you think people are still focused more on mitigation rather than adaptation? Raise your hands if you believe that they are focused more on mitigation at this point. There are some very, very positive folks in this room who think that there's lots of focus on adaptation. So
you should pose the question the other way around. Perhaps there are some.
You pose the question for me. Do you think that people are focused enough on adaptation? We're on the right track. Raise your hands if you think in Europe we're on the right track for adaptation. Well, that answers it. I think, thank you for making me rephrase that question, because then I have to come to you, Nicholas, and ask you, you have to bear the brunt of this. Very, very expensive claims coming down the road. what role do you, as an industry, play in trying to convince companies, citizens that adaptation is the way forward before it becomes too expensive, as it's been said?
Thank you for the question, and also thank you very much for the opportunity to provide an insurance perspective to all these important questions. I can confirm that in the insurance sector we see the cost of claims increasing year after year on average. And clearly we see that this is due to both the two aspects, mitigation and adaptation. So we see that climate change is happening, which is resulting in an increase in the intensity and severity and frequency of events. And I think Mr. Van den Berg mentioned a lot of facts that are pointing to the fact that we are not necessarily going in the right direction. One of the figures from last year that I find most astonishing is this increase of 3.8 ppm of CO2 concentration, which hasn't been discussed much, but that is quite a staggering increase in CO2 concentrations in just a period of 1 year. So showing that this is an issue, and at the same time it is true that we are failing to adapt properly. We are still building in areas which are risky, we are still building in the wrong way, so we are also very clearly not doing what is necessary. And so we need to act on both fronts, and insurance companies are acting on both sides, on the mitigation side through their investment in renewable energy, or by not insuring certain types of practices, but also they can do, and they do a lot in the area of adaptation or resilience or preparedness, or what we call typically in the insurance sector prevention, which is one which has always been in the DNA of insurers. You can think of campaigns to avoid that people drive when they drink, so that has been something that the insurance sector has done for decades, and also in a way in natural catastrophes it's no different. So let me give a couple of examples of what insurers do in this field. And mostly it's, well, one aspect is obviously to use the expertise that they have in risk modeling and in data in order to advise on many things. They can advise municipalities, they can advise policyholders in terms of where to build, how to build. That's something that is being done on the basis of data, which can be own company data or public data, but using the risk modeling capacity of insurers. They can also advise specifically their policyholders on measures that they can take to reduce their own exposures, and that can result potentially in a reduction in premium, or in areas which are very risky that can turn something which is uninsurable into something that becomes insurable. So that's really something I believe important. Increasingly, insurers are sending early warning signals when there is an event that's happening in order to take the right measures, in order to limit the exposure, moving a car, or avoiding to have things that can be dangerous in the garden, and things like that. And increasingly as well, insurers are involved in education initiatives, from developing education booklets to developing master courses in universities on the consequences of climate change. So these are examples of what insurers can do to contribute to the objective of resilience,
preparedness. If I can flip that question and ask, are we at risk, like say for example in the United States, where insurers find that the climate issue is so dangerous now that they just will not insure? And that leads to entire states running the risk of zero investment. So California, a great example of this. So much of California at this point, insurers just will not touch it. Do we run that risk here in Europe, that folks in your industry just are going to stop touching certain parts of Europe?
Yes, I think that's a risk that with climate change continuing to increase, or with an increasing change in climate and with a failure to adapt, you may find yourself in a situation where a number of areas and a number of risks become uninsurable, or uninsurable at affordable prices. So that's why the two aspects are so important. We need to continue to focus on limiting, reducing emissions, but we also need to urgently accelerate adaptation, because there is an element of certain risks becoming difficult to insure at affordable prices, yes.
So that's a risk that we run. So Frank, did you just come in from London?
I came in on Friday, so.
Well, so
I
you've
got
had the
a Belgian
benefit of this
weekend.
beautiful sunshine that we've had for weeks and weeks
Yeah,
and
yeah.
weeks, where everyone's loving the fact that it's not wet, miserable, and grey. Probably the same here as Brussels, but everyone forgetting that while they're sunbathing in their gardens, as the English tend to do, we're running the risk of droughts in 34 councils at this point, in 34 areas in the UK. When you're facing situations like this, and insurers saying that potentially you're running the risk of being uninsured in certain regions, how do you make a strong case for investment in adaptation? Supply chains, security was brought up. How do you really sell that story that we need to invest and we need to do it now?
I would say with insurance, when some certain things become uninsurable, we have to understand why. So one thing we should avoid is insure people to build, insure houses that are to be built in floodable zones, or if it's very dry, we should avoid building in zones where there is high risk of forest. And so that is a typical case of moral hazard. If it's uninsurable, it just tells us don't invest. And that is particularly important if the insurance is subsidized. So we have good reasons to also think about transfers when we want to keep insurance affordable for low-income households. But then the risk of moral hazard can be higher. Now, it can also be that actually insurance is a complicated business and there is a lot of asymmetric information, and actually people should get insured because they're stuck in a very complicated situation. So maybe this is a house that is built 200 years ago, and actually leaving that house is not the option. That you want to have these people coverage for these people, and that's then a different question. And that's then also where the public good investments come in. So if we think about droughts, you may think about dams who do two things. They keep water for dry periods, and they also can keep water if downstream we are at risk of floods. And that are things that the private sector cannot do. Like, this is a public good, and it's going to be a public investment, or it's going to not be an investment. That's not the case for everything. So some of the adaptation actually, yeah, you can count on individual initiative. For example, the biggest killer from climate change is heat waves. Now, heat waves, a very good way to avoid dying from heat waves is insulation. Insulation is very costly. So it's a widely misperception that insulation will pay itself back. There are few things that pay themselves back. They are costly, and I've seen in among policymakers sometimes they think, oh, it's like cost effective. So the only thing that we need to do is make funds available, and that turns out to be often not enough. Now, why is it so not that cost effective? It's also because, take the Belgian example, heating fuel is relatively cheap. We don't have a carbon tax on it, or it's not an EU ETS. So the EU ETS 2 is going to help with making this a stronger economic case, and we're talking about big investments, like upgrading a house, 30,000 euro or 20,000 euro, and so that is also an opportunity, and it's obviously saving emissions mitigation, but it saves also lives in hot years. Another thing is that very often what I hear among policymakers, they prefer avoiding spending energy over decarbonizing energy. There is this like somehow a preference for insulation rather than putting the same money in a heat pump with the same effect. And I think that's fine initially when most things we're doing are relatively cheap, but the cheap opportunities are mostly captured by now. We have to be careful. And I would say heat pumps, in the choice between heat pumps and insulation, just go for the cost-effective way. Some of the very old houses are very hard to insulate. You can live with a heat pump and then to connect that to the adaptation, heat pumps also do AC. So they are also a solution for the summer to avoid people dying in heat waves. And one of the things that is sometimes overlooked in the investment incentives is that in many electricity markets, the prices are not flexible. So people hate flexible prices, and they shouldn't. So a heat pump can have a reserve of heat water, warm that up when electricity is abundant. Maybe there is like a sunny afternoon. Get ready for the. Warm your system up when there is too much, and so that it keeps the cost down. I had a look for a heat pump. Not only does it cost me 10,000 or 15,000 euros, it will then also be relatively costly at current fixed price of electricity. And so there is some institutional thinking there to make heat pumps cheaper.
So the storytelling right now is not connecting the dots. We need to perhaps give all of the advantages and present it. Is that what you're saying to policymakers, saying think a little bit differently about how you're presenting these solutions so that there is an incentive for private sector to come in and say this is going to be cheaper down the road? Or is this now public funds only, everybody needs to just expect the subsidies to come in and then it'll be less painful, which won't politically fly, as we've learned?
So I think the public storyline is relatively fine. Insulate your house, and people are going to do it, and it's about a lot of money, a lot of investment. But then if you really start counting and do your net present value calculation or your payback time of your insulation, policymakers have to set the prices right. And so there is one option: you subsidize. That's the way we did until now. Very effective when things are relatively cheap and you're not doing much. But then the subsidy budget only goes so far. So typically what's happening, once there is really big enthusiasm and everybody starts to go for a subsidy, the budget is gone and the measure stops. So that's why also getting the price right for fuel is another way to solve the same problem of cost effectiveness. And once the true cost of fuel is what you pay, insulating your house becomes cost effective. And then you create investments, and people will then also be prepared for heat.
So perhaps this is a conversation that I keep hearing about, that there needs to be this public-private dialogue so that everyone's incentives are aligned and the conversation can be more aligned to industry, to the public sector, and to, of course, political maneuverings that everyone needs to do. So Karen, if I can ask you, how do you incentivize local adaptation decisions? I mean, the German context is an interesting one, and kind of sell that idea of long-term. This is good for you long-term, so that it doesn't get caught up in the cycle of this is too expensive, this is politically a dangerous situation, the noise is quite a bit, we don't have to do it right now, all of the noise that we're hearing. So how do we do that at a more micro level?
I mean, the first thing is probably to provide the information. I mean, this is, although we do have a lot of information already available, many times on the ground in the municipalities or for individual firms, they don't really have the data. Are they at risk? Are they not at risk? And to take a responsible decision, you have to have that data. I mean, that's the first thing, information availability, and then basically also doing it on a micro level is sometimes challenging, and not every either country or state in Germany is at the same pace on that. But then, of course, even if you have the information, as we all know from climate mitigation, doesn't necessarily coerce action. If you're a community leader who can build a kindergarten or improve the sports venues versus investing in something like adaptation, which might pay off in 10 years' time or not if you don't have a disaster, that's of course difficult to sell to constituents. So I think this notion of actually not focusing only on the cost, but also making the benefits available, like the greening of infrastructure. Actually, have a cooler city, you might not run the risk of having flooding as much, but especially this cooler city. I mean, I was in Amsterdam last year for about a month, and I enjoyed it so much because so much green, so much water. It's a completely different climate than in other cities. So information on the dangers, information on the benefits as well, and then also supporting especially municipalities on the administrative, institutional level. They sometimes just feel completely overwhelmed. They don't know what the dangers are. They don't know how to deal with it, how to address them. So you need coordination also between especially smaller communities. You need to make them available of what potential aid is out there. I mean, I found it interesting that there was a study by the European Court of Auditors that actually said the framework that the EU has is sound, but it doesn't really trickle down to the municipal level. Many of the municipalities, especially smaller communities, they don't have any action plan with respect to adaptation yet. So coordination between the municipalities, but then also providing access to financing, especially the public goods. I mean, where there is no really incentive for private actors to become active, while still incentivizing also private capital. I mean, in some areas which are really important also in the context of adaptation or resilience. I mean, water, one of them. Water is, to some degree, it's across regions, but that's also a very regional, very local component. And we see in different countries in Europe that the water administration is organized very differently. In some regions, there's all stakeholders actually pitching in. I mean, industry needs this. Agriculture, households. So if you bring everybody together, you might, depending on the topic, actually have a better chance to get that through. So always this label participation where some people like me are like, not that again, but I mean, bringing people together and convincing them of the cause is actually one means to support, to get the support that you actually need.
I have to caveat this. Karen's also part of the Bavarian Climate Council. Are they listening to you in Bavaria?
And I told her explicitly not to
Since
ask
we're
that
here.
question.
Since we're here.
No, I just found it
You don't have
interesting.
to answer that.
No, I just find it interesting because when I was new on the council, there was the first Bavarian adaptation strategy. I think that was in 2016 and 17. And at the time, I was kind of missing the strategic element. Everybody was just pitching in what they think is necessary. And I think it's developing from there, but this is one of the question marks I always have when I also see, for example, the federal German adaptation law and strategy is always about reducing risks by a significant amount. Sometimes colloquially as minimizing the risk. What is that? I mean, are you willing to pay about everything just to get the risk down to something very, very small? Or are you actually thinking about costs and benefits? Because then you will have probably less adaptation or resilience level than if you minimize everything. And I think that is something that is often not clear, not to communities and not to federal decision makers. And the other thing is also, and that was also in the keynote, was stressed that there is not money for everything. So we need to prioritize. But what are the rules? What is the, like, what do we take the decisions according to?
Well, let's ask
There's
Blas.
not much about that.
Let's ask Blas, because since he's feeding the information into the Commission, what should we prioritize? You're giving them the data at this point. They're very happy to credit you with that. There's enough data, you're saying. There's enough sharing, but again, it's not trickling down, to Karen's point. What do we need to change? Is it a narrative change? Is it a focal change? What are you telling them to focus on at this point? Because we're distracted. We're distracted with defense at this point in this city and across capital cities across Europe.
Yeah. Narrative changes is really like the word now which is popping up everywhere. And we have already...
I coined this way before it was popular.
Yeah. So we already heard in the keynote, climate resilience is part of the security. You cannot invest in security if you are not resilient. You cannot invest in competitiveness if the continent, country, or the region is resilient, because you cannot compete, because you are, if you have an extreme event destroying your economy every year, example of Slovenia, already mentioned, and I'm coming from Slovenia, I've seen it, 16%, more than 16% of GDP was lost in 24 hours due to the flooding. How you can recover the economy if you are losing this kind of, let's say, amount regularly? So we are not changing the narrative. We need to put systemic approach towards describing what resilience is, what security is, and what defense is. And if the focus of the policymakers is now in the defense security, we need to invest into climate resilience. And this is part of the narrative, and of course we can be surprised why is only now coming this up in 2025. We know already for years that climate resilience is part of the bigger picture, and more needs to be, becoming a part of bigger economic investments. It's coming, it's slow, maybe some will say too slow, but it's coming. So in 5-10 years, we will have, let's say, proper investment into the climate resilience. So I'm not saying that the narrative needs to be changed, but whenever politician needs to decide on the investment into the resilience, climate resilience is part of it. No? And societal preparedness includes the climate resilience, and this is part of the day-to-day discussion which needs to happen regularly in the future. No?
And accessing all of the research that your researchers are doing, I think, is par for the course for that. So, Nicholas, here's a question. What would you ask for folks who are in the policy world? What would you ask of the politicians that you have to deal with to ensure that your industry, a critically important industry within the European Union, can survive and also help other industries grow? Because the Draghi report keeps coming up. We keep talking about resilience. This is, at the end of the day, as Karen pointed out, an economic, it's economics at the end of the day. So what would you ask? What's your ask?
Thank you. This is my chance. And it's a very good question. It's a very difficult one as well, because as other speakers have said, adaptation is really a concept, or resilience or preparedness. It's something that has to happen at all sorts of levels, and it's something that involves very big projects, potentially like building a dam, or very small ones like turning a city into a sponge city by removing some pavements and letting the water infiltrate, or having more green roofs. I mean, there is really such a long list of things that are contributing to increasing resilience. So in the past, as was mentioned, there was this adaptation strategy, and countries were developing adaptation plans. And what I heard back then by some of my members is that some countries made good use of those plans, and that it really had an impact. It really was helping, but that required member states to be serious about drafting their plans and then implementing them. So, and that was not the case necessarily everywhere, but in some cases it really made a difference. So you are asking about the asks. I mean, and the question being then, what can the EU do that is adding value to what has to happen at member states level, at local level, etc. So one of the questions that is being discussed currently is whether having more done on the side of awareness is a good idea. So EIOPA published, the European Supervisory Authority for the Insurance Sector, published a consultation on a risk awareness tool with a proposal to make it a European tool. And so we had a reflection, and we thought that this is not necessarily the immediate first step that is necessary. We have such tools in a number of countries. In Germany, you have the Naturgefahren check and the Hochwasser check. You have the HORA in Austria, DGO in Denmark, GeoRisk in France, etc. So you have a couple of tools that exist that are helpful in increasing awareness of the risks. We think that in light of all the differences between countries, in light of the different risk exposure, etc., it may be more appropriate to try to have as an objective to have these tools available in all member states rather than to try to impose such a tool from the top. Another issue is data. I think we should really not underestimate all the work that's being done in terms of increasing the amount of data, and that's really something where the EU can bring a lot of value, because the more data is available publicly, the better insurers, for instance, can model the risk and can therefore advise or insure, because the more data you have, the more you can insure and advise on insurability. So this is really something where I think the EU can add value.
Well, you and Blas need to have a conversation, because the data is there. It just needs to trickle to the industry. So I'm going to eat a little bit into your coffee break, because I want to ask you if you have any questions of the folks up here. And if you do, please raise your hand and we will get you the question. Just need your name, your organization, and the question you have or an observation you have. Anyone? Be brave. This is Brussels. We like to speak our mind. Adaptation, folks, in Europe. No one has a question? Yes, thank you. This is a very well-behaved audience for Brussels.
Hello, and thank you very much for your invitation to this event. My name is Marlene Hopfgartner. I'm from the Tyrolean Chamber of Commerce, and I'm not asking a question from my Chamber of Commerce profession, but from a private aspect. I'm from a small valley in Tyrol. It's called Stubaital. I don't know if anybody knows it. We have a glacier, we have Alps, we have high mountains, and we had a flood event in 2023. So a really bad flood event with damaged landscape, and the wood was damaged. And we paid millions of repairing costs and bringing all back to order. But then the after event was that our wood was damaged, and we ran against time because of the bark beetle. Yeah. We had to fly out all of the dead wood, because otherwise our wood, with a protection against avalanches and landslide, would be damaged as a whole. And this was an unforeseen event. You know, we had this event of flooding, and then we had the event of this bark beetle. Nobody thought about it. And so I think you have a damage, and then you have afterwards other risks that you must foresee then. So that's just a comment, not a question, but that was an experience which was made for us in 2023. And I think the same is for Slovenia, maybe.
Yeah, that's a really good example of the cascading risk. When it comes that basically one event triggers that the risk is cascading from one system to another. And in climate risk assessment, we have focused a lot on that, and we will focus more on that, about how is this triggered down the large scale into the economy. And at the end, it goes about economy and people. And all these kind of events, which can be, in the end, be a damaging ecosystem, can then trigger that is basically food supply can be let's say, at risk, and at the end goes into the for example, health aspects of the people, and in the end, also affecting the economy. And this is the complexity of addressing the risk and resilience, because everything is connected, no? And you can go even further. Bark beetle and the forest actually will then affect the potential of the country, of the region, to increase the uptake of CO2. And then again, we are having the loop back to the climate mitigation, because more the environment is damaged, less the uptake of CO2 is happening, and then climate change is getting even more accelerating. And these events will be more and more visible, will be in the higher, let's say, geographical scales, and this is then becoming a real threat to the society. So everything what we need to address needs to be addressed then systemically, you know? And that's a big challenge here. You know?
Frank?
Yeah, I wanted to connect to that to make the point that what we call the beta on an investment is interesting for adaptation investments. So the beta is actually the question, is the investment especially interesting when we're in trouble? Like, or is it especially interesting when we're in good times? And so an investment in stocks has a positive beta because you get a lot of money when things go well with the world. But adaptation is the opposite. So it's a hedge you get, and that's why it's more valuable because you're doing all these expenses after having spent already the millions for the first shock. So it's particularly painful. And that is even more valid for systemic risk. So in your case of a village, you can still say insurance is going to do the job. But on a macro scale, so climate damage is a supply shock. And so for a demand shock, the US stops buying from Europe now, what's the solution? You can say, okay, investment push, and we're going to raise funds and invest. But if you have a supply shock, this logic of now we're going to invest is harder because you don't have necessarily the means because you've already been hit. And so that's important to acknowledge, and it can go against the political feasibility. Like when COVID was happening, there was reasonable motivation to avoid disasters. But actually, we were already in a disaster, and the funds were not that easy to find. Whereas now we've forgotten COVID, and we should now, invest in the next disaster, but it's no longer on the agenda. So it's good to have that foresight and to get connect to this long-term view that you need for proper adaptation.
Karen, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that's minorly related to that. I just had the feeling that on the panel we focused very much on providing data and also to make for public authorities, for the state to make the right decisions. I think we did not really pay enough attention on what private citizens can do, because kind of like with mitigation, where in the beginning it was like, oh, the state has to fund everything, we subsidize it, the state has to do it. We kind of realize now that it's much down to private decisions, whether it's in companies or with people. And I think the same will happen with respect to adaptation. How do we actually get firms and households to make better decisions and to create less costs, less legacy for the future? Insurances can play a big role in that, but then you also have, which we didn't really touch upon, which might be on the next panel, the whole question of Europe being part of the global economy, and many of the adaptation, not resilience, adaptation needs are outside of Europe. And many of our companies are actually very vulnerable in that respect. How do we get the information to them? How do we make them aware? So that's a whole other discussion in order to get the private capital to make really efficient decisions to get the allocation of our capital in the economy right. And I think that's something we unfortunately didn't have the time really to talk about.
I know, and we've already eaten into their coffee time. So final question to you, Nicholas, to bring up that point. When someone has a crisis like that and you have a cascade effect and insurance has paid out, is there a question even posed, and I'm also going to take the onus as a consumer, is a question ever posed to the insurance company saying, am I getting the insurance money, and am I putting the right solution in place? Is the insurer able to give them, from all of the experience you have, advice on what they should and should not do so that they don't incur a second problem of, for example, beetles? Is that possible when a private citizen or a private customer decides to take action? Because the responsibility is with us as well. Mm-hmm. Can you provide that kind of data and information as a private sector?
I mean, yes, I think that's part of the role that an insurance sector, that the insurance company plays. To advise on what to do to get insurance. So that's happening, obviously.
Is that science-based? I mean, do you have scientists, are you working with scientists for potential solutions in places where you've had to pay out?
Yes, I mean this is of course happening and obviously work in progress, because climate change is evolving, the risks are evolving, the information is provided on the basis of data. That's always the same thing, data and risk modeling. So once the data is available, the risk modeling capacity is there. There will be advice being provided on what to do. It can happen at the level of municipalities. It can happen at the level of an individual policy holders. So that's indeed the case.
Well, we'll wrap this conversation up, but we will pick up to Karen's point on how do we share this information? How do we kind of get better about our resilience and preparedness, because adaptation's now turning into an obsolete word. But on that note, please give them a round of applause. They've been fantastic at setting the stage.